Good morning, everyone. After that sobering presentation, I'm hoping that we can have a conversation about some of the opportunities that the policy environment might present us over the next few years. We might not get there, given where we are in terms of policy in Australia at the moment, but I'm hoping to focus on some of the risks and the opportunities that the policy environment delivers. We've actually got an excellent panel up here to have that conversation. So on my far left, Martijn Wilder, who a lot of you will know, who's the founding partner at Pollination, which Martijn asked me to describe as a boutique merchant bank focused on accelerating low-carbon solutions. We have Innes Wilcox, who's the CEO of the Australian Industry Group, one of Australia's most influential business organisations. Sarah McNamara from the Australian Energy Council. The Energy Council represents big electricity companies and small and downstream gas producers. And of course, Tony Marr, who's the General President, is that the right word, Tony? Of the Energy and Mining Division of the CFMEU. But before we jump into discussion, I thought I'd just start off with some opening remarks, because IGCC over the last 9 months or so has been revisiting our policy priorities, engaging with our members about what is most important to them in terms of public policy, but also talking with our members and engaging with our members about how we can better influence and engage with policymakers and the stakeholders that make climate policy possible. So I just wanted to recognise and thank the policy working group that I work with for all the work and the support that they've been giving us, and all of our members for engagement with particularly the media that we've been doing over the last little while. And from IGCC's point of view, we've sort of developed 3 broad policies areas which we think are really important based on our member feedback, and that's around economic strategies to deliver net zero emissions, making sure that we get the transformation and the integration of energy and climate policy done well so we can actually unlock investment in the energy sector, but also critically building resilience to the impacts of climate change. And the point I'd make on this one is this is an area where we're actually finding some very positive engagement with governments all across Australia, because we're sort of in a world now, I think, where in the past we've always considered climate change as a future problem, and now policymakers and others are now recognising that it's a now problem, and they're grappling with how they change that mindset, but also what policies they need to put in place. And there's a lot that I think governments can learn from what investors are doing. I think the other important thing to note is that the public policy work that we do is just not about sitting down writing detailed policies and engaging with policymakers. It's also about engaging with stakeholders, such as the group up on the stage here, but it's also with the media, and it's also in the public conversation. Because as we all know, delivering long-term sustainable returns for the members that we represent means that we actually have to have a constructive, positive policy conversation which delivers for those members' returns in the long term. And I think this is where some of the collaboration we do with some of the people up on this stage becomes really important, but also making sure that we're making our voices heard within the public conversation becomes really important. So today we're going to focus on 3 broad areas. We're going to talk a bit about sort of what's coming up in the next 3 to 5 years in terms of Australian policy. We're not going to talk a lot about New Zealand, because they seem to be doing okay at the moment and moving in the right direction. So it's a lot easier in my engagement with the New Zealand government than it is with the Australian government at the moment. Talk a bit about the risks and the opportunities that come from in the energy sector in particular, but also, is there a gap emerging between what businesses and investors are doing and government policies? And if that exists, or if it doesn't, and I know Martijn has particular views on that, what is the role of how can we actually start to bridge that gap? So I actually might start with you, Martijn, because you've just been in New York for the Secretary-General's Climate Summit. In terms of Australian policy, what do you think is emerging globally that will impact on Australian policy making over the next 3 to 5 years in terms of policy, technology, community attitudes?
Yes, I think so. One of the takeaways from New York was that there is a very significant ramp-up of the narrative that's going on around climate change among the whole community, but there's not necessarily the action to follow that. And I think it was a lot of the things that we saw happening in 2000, and I'd say 10, 15... It was when the carbon market was really booming, 2008, 2012 or so. Are sort of starting to come back. So we're seeing a lot of those people looking at how to invest in this sector in the more innovative end of it coming back into the market, including a lot of those people who did that originally, which I thought was quite interesting. And there's no doubt the ramp up of language, also a lot driven by Greta as well, what's going on there, was evident, but I still think we're a way away from that sort of moving in that direction. The other thing about policy, which we were sort of talking about this morning, is that you can't look at policy in isolation. So it's a lot more complicated. So a number of governments around the world are very far advanced in terms of setting specific legislation that drives change, and we all know about the examples of Norway with electric vehicles. Those specific targets that you will change a sector by a specific time have far more impact than setting an aspirational target of being net zero by 2050. And so when you look at Australia, the Australian context, it is more complex than I think. Looking from outside, everyone says to me, "Oh, Australia's so backward and it's so terrible in its policy." And yes, we've got a sort of a very difficult, complex energy space. But on the flip side of that, we've got every state government in Australia just about as committed to net zero emissions by 2050 without necessarily a clear plan how they'll get there. We've got many governments at a local level doing many very innovative things. And when you look at the complexity of the energy system here and what we're dealing with and grappling with is partly a result of the fact that there is a significant amount of investment. So speaking from my guest position as chair of ARENA, what we've seen in terms of how much investment in the sector is why we're having so much challenges about how you bring this all together and how it all comes together. So I think when you're talking about policy, policy in Australia is multifaceted at many different levels. It's true we don't have a clear energy policy. We don't have a particularly aggressive target relative to other countries, but there's an enormous amount going on here. And so one of the challenges is how, in a very messy environment, do you actually position yourself and where do you go and how do you go? And I would also say that probably Australia and the US are two very different environments to the policy environment in most of the rest of the world. So when we come to where business and policies, we'll talk about that later on, but I think there is a little bit of a disconnect there. But I think in the Australian context, everyone talks about having clear long-term policy. We need a very clear energy policy. We need to deal with some of those challenges, but we also need policies across how do we actually transition a whole economy. So for those states that have committed to the net zero by 2050, what is their plan to get there? I know in the next session, after this, the one later today, we'll talk about more economic transition. We need to be talking about big picture, holistic transition of those economies, not just talking about small policies around the edges.
Thanks, Martijn. Actually, that's a good segue to a question I was going to ask Sarah, because one of the things that we've seen in Australia over the last decade or so has been a move away from governments from broad-based policies like carbon pricing and more sectoral approaches and more direct intervention in markets. Do you think it's actually possible to work from the point where we are now to deliver, given all these policies at disparate state level, some at federal level, some at local level, can that form the basis through time of an investable policy framework, do you think?
Well, it's difficult to say. I think there are always opportunities, even in chaotic policy environments. Savvy investors are always going to find a way to sort of maximise their benefit. But really it's always optimal to have, as you say, a broad-based, nationally consistent framework, particularly in electricity, where we're dealing with what is an electricity market that takes up the whole of the eastern seaboard of Australia. We need to be able to send investors clear and stable signals. The difficulty at the moment is state and federal legislation is often inconsistent, and the rules keep on changing. And until that settles down, it's going to be very hard to stabilise that investment environment.
So I'll go ask Ines you a similar sort of question, because we've seen this patchwork emerge. But also the role of emissions-intensive, trade-exposed industries has been central to the conversation in Australia over the years. Do you see any opportunities for policy to emerge over the next few years which would actually encourage greater investment in those industries and emission reductions while at the same time maintaining their international competitiveness?
Well, we all have to be perpetually optimistic, Erwin, so optimism is what gets us out of bed in the morning, and if we weren't optimistic, we'd all give up. But look, we've been through waves and we were just talking outside about how this has been going for a decade or more. In fact, and then I was just sitting here reflecting. You go back to waves through Kyoto back in 97, 98, and then Rio, and then it sort of climate sort of went a bit quiet for a while there, and it's re-emerged. But industry has sort of kept up behind the waves and tried to pick where the next wave will be, and that's the role of industry here. Do we see a way forward? Yes, there is a way forward, but we're not going to get there on this road that we're on now. Basically, so I wear a couple of hats. I sit on the board of Australian Super, big investor. I run Australian Industry Group during the day, which represents industries across manufacturing, construction, utilities, transport, and the like. There is, and we'll come to it certainly, but there is almost a bifurcation between industry and policy. Yeah. And there are very clear trend lines that industry is following. You see those emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries taking steps on their own. Some of the biggest investors in renewable energy are those emissions-intensive trade-exposed industries. So look at, like, say, for instance, what BlueScope has done or Aurora have done around renewable energy. So industry sort of knows where the trends are going here. But at the same time, those trends aren't enough, as we sit here in 2019, to sustain industry going forward. So we're in a sort of not a holding pattern, far from it, because there's a lot of change happening. But we're just not. We're sort of betwixt and between at the moment, and that's what makes it difficult for industry when it comes to investment going forward. When it comes to picking directions or seeking or trying to work out what policy certainty looks like, it becomes very difficult for industry. So in a room full of investors here, industry finds it increasingly difficult to make reasoned, calculated investment when it comes to energy space because of that policy uncertainty. So as a result of that, industry is sort of going in its own way in many ways, and is sort of can't ignore policy at all, but is taking its own path because they're not getting any clear direction from policy. So can we get there? Yes, we can, but at the moment we're seeing brawls within brawls all over the place again as you get in a post-election environment in Australia. I've said before, I'm happy to say it again, energy policy is like our Brexit, and we just cannot resolve it. And hopefully we will one day, but it's been going for a long time. In the meantime, industry has just had to get on with things, make the investments where they can, see which way the wind is blowing, and make decisions around their future sustainability, sort of almost separate from policy.
So Tony, because it's of course not just about the policy environment just doesn't affect business, it also affects communities, it affects workers. We are seeing, I think, from my point of view, just being involved in climate policy over the last 30 years, a sort of an increasing mainstreaming of the concept of just transition and needing to actually bring communities and workers along with us and engage them and actually find real solutions to the challenges that they face. Do you see any opportunities emerging in Australia over the next 3 or 4 years where we can actually have a sensible conversation about how we manage the transition in affected communities?
Well, we have no choice but to have the conversation, and I agree with Innes, you've got to be optimistic in the darkest times, and these are the darkest times. Look, just transition has been mainstreamed in name, but not in practice. It's part of the Paris Agreement, but almost nobody knows about it. We were campaigning for a just transition of statutory authority before the last election. Unfortunately, it was backed by the losing side. So there won't be any government assistance for host communities and the workforces affected by policy or lack of policy. And that's a great shame. We produced a report last year, commissioned research from the University of New South Wales, comparing the approaches of various countries. Germany is by far and away the only country that can say we've had a just transition or are planning for it. They got through, in the black coal industry, 130,000 staff without a single forced retrenchment, and they all got decent jobs or early retirement. So that's the sort of thing that will prevent victims happening. See, when Australian workers see politicians talk about just transition as they did in the last federal election, they just don't believe it because they've never seen it. They can't kick the tyres. It's never happened in Australia. Workers always get screwed. Communities always get broken. They're actually not wrong. So we have to prove to them that it can happen. We can be Germany. And that will take, in the Australian context, that'll be a real challenge for business and for investors to prioritise that social and political dimension of the policies we're talking about. But in the Australian context, as the last election showed, unless you eliminate victims to the greatest extent possible, the political dynamic in Australia is that change will be resisted and it will determine outcomes. And there's a reason why this coalition government is taking the non-policy stance it's taking, and that's because it's politically profitable. So I would urge investors to take account of that social and political dimension and try and get some real meaning into just transition.
Can I just follow up on that? Because there's a couple of elements to that. One is what investors can do in terms of the money that they deploy. There was also the question about what role they play in the public conversation. As you say, it was a dominant theme in the last election. Do you have any advice, gratuitous advice, that you'd like to give investors on those fronts?
Well, let me single one out. AGL has committed, in the closure of its Liddell power station, not to have any forced retrenchments. Now, I haven't heard any voice come out and say that's a great thing and that's what we should try and emulate. I mean, that's the conversation that we need to start to have. Investors ought to get interested in that. And they're doing that without any statutory framework. Now, we've got negotiations about the detail of that, and it's going to be difficult, but it will involve transfer of workers from one power station to a neighbouring one, and for some of the workers to be at the Liddell site, where there'll be various facilities. And then, of course, all the workers here is a debate about whether or not it's going to be sold to another operator who hasn't made any commitment to the workforce. So you can understand how workers get confused and angry. So I would encourage investors to pay attention to what happens to the workforces and the host communities.
Thanks, Tony. So talking about power station closures and the energy sector in particular, so Sarah, your members engage right across Australia in terms of the energy market. What do you actually see as the biggest risk at the moment in terms of investment in the electricity sector from the policy point of view? And what do you think are there any bright spots or opportunities there?
Well, the biggest risk is the policy uncertainty and the sort of chaotic policy environment we're in at the moment. And what we're trying to do now is to tell market operators and regulators and policymakers that we need to slow down and look at the competing reform processes we have underway at the moment and actually take stock and work out which of them we need to progress and in what order, so that we're not running a sort of a congruency risk where you sort of get inconsistent or overlapping policy outcomes and we end up with an electricity grid that is somehow gold-plated unnecessarily. We think the real focus needs to be on the ESB's 2025 market review. We think that's absolutely critical, that work over the next 12 months is done really well. And lots of other policy reforms flow off that. If we can get the 2025 outcomes right, then we can start filling in the gaps in terms of what the market looks like and how it operates after 2025.
So I might throw to the rest of the panel then, in terms of from your own perspective, like Sarah's outlined, what the Energy Council would see as what we have to get right in the next 3 to 5 years. Martijn, what would you say to that question?
Well, I think first of all, we've got one of the things people are not really looking at is within the national electricity market rules, there are a lot of barriers at the moment in those rules. There are a lot of things that don't allow the transition. We need to actually have a focus on where are the problems in those rules, remove those obstacles and actually start to enable more things to happen. I think that's one area where a lot of focus is needed. Secondly, I think some governments, particularly state governments, and a couple have done this, need to basically underwrite assets. So if there are projects, and we had a presentation from Genex this morning, one of the big challenges that they had was the transmission line. Sometimes you've just got to have a vision to say, well, it's worth opening up this area. The government will step in, they'll basically underwrite the asset, they'll build the asset, the transmission line, and then if they want to privatise it, that's fine. But just trying to think a little bit differently to circuit break some of these things so that we can open up sectors. That opens up new opportunities for manufacturing, opens up new opportunities to do other things in areas that are, quite frankly, suffering from climate change. So a lot of the farming communities, it opens up the ability to do greenhouses and other things, and to think a little bit more holistically and strategically. At the other end of the spectrum, we've also got Finkel telling us that hydrogen's the next major LNG sector for Australia, and we need to. There's a rapid sort of discussion at the moment on hydrogen and a lot of things around hydrogen going on, and you'll hear more from Arena on that as well. And so I think in that context, there's you've got the sort of how do you fix the existing framework, but also what is our vision at a much bigger picture level to circuit break some of these challenges.
Innes?
Well, I sort of endorse that general framework. I mean, what do we need here? Well, we need everyone to step back for a minute and then come back together. I'm talking about industry and government at multi-level here, to try to forge a pathway forward, to give us some certainty and some clarity around the next decade. That's the biggest inhibitor. Sarah mentioned AGL. AGL have given 7 years' notice on the closure of Liddell after Engie shut down Hazelwood with 6 months' notice, which has sort of caused enormous problems through the system. But AGL is sort of being beaten up horrendously because they have given that warning, and that is just then given. What that has then done is then give governments the opportunity to step in and basically browbeat them and beat them around. And I think, I can't talk for AGL, but any sensible person in this space, if they had their time again, would rethink that strategy again because of the pressure that has been put on them. You've got state governments. This is why, in many ways, why the COAG meeting on the 22nd of November is so crucial, because you've got state governments threatening to go their own way in a whole range of different areas, which would just be catastrophic for the system as a whole, because then you will not get investment certainty if states do go off and do their own thing. We've been to that dance before in the mid-2000s, and it was a disaster. So we need them to come together and to work through a pathway forward for the electricity market and for the energy market more broadly. Now, of course, there's going to be changes and tensions around the side, but we just need some clear directions and some certainty and some bipartisanship, both at a political level and at a federal state level around that, or else the investment will continue to dry up or will not come forward as it could do, which will be disastrous for business and, to Tony's point, and the point I make too, for communities as well.
I might just add, I think we all accept that government intervention is kind of the new normal in this market, and the government, or the federal government, for example, owns all of Snowy Hydro, which has both a retail and a generating business. But for every entry into the market that government makes, it moves the deck chairs around for private investors, and sometimes crowds out what would otherwise have been a private investment decision. Now that's fine, but I just sound a note of caution that we have in the industry about watching increasing amounts of government intervention and investment in the market. It can be a positive thing if it's done strategically and in the right place, but it can also end up risking taxpayers' money in circumstances where private investment may well have achieved the same goal had the market been left to work.
Let me just make one comment. There's a big difference between having a big stick and telling the energy companies that if you don't do X, Y, Z, we're going to come after you, which is sort of like which is sort of anti-sort of free market, which is some of the stuff the government's been talking about, compared to things like governments providing guarantees where investors are scared to make an investment. So the stuff which the CFC did for a long time, and the stuff that Arena and others do, is about trying to create investments to make them happen, to crowd in private sector funding. I think we do a lot of that. I mean, our aid agencies do a lot of that overseas. We provide government guarantees. The infrastructure fund for the Pacific, which the government has set up, is about providing guarantees for finance and investment. Those sort of measures can actually play a big role in this market, but doing things which is sort of telling energy companies that if they charge too much, etc., they'll shut them down. And things are very, very different.
I'd just say one thing is, of course, there's a role for government here and the government to set frameworks. And that was why a lot of us here were, while it was not perfect, perhaps far from it, we were quite keen on the National Energy Guarantee, was because it did set up a framework which everyone could operate within. That's gone. But you could mount a very strong argument that part of the reason that we are here where we are now is because governments have continually, at all levels, intervened in the market and come and gone from that market, and then sort of essentially pricked holes in the balloon so that it's deflated.
I just want to move us to a question around the role of business and whether they're ahead of government or not. And I know, like Tony, you engage with the big miners on a regular basis at a senior level. Do you get a sense that business is moving ahead of government, and is there an opportunity, do you think, to actually bridge the gap between if business is moving ahead, whether there's an opportunity to use that to start to try and bridge the gap between government policy and where busineses are at?
You've put me in the unusual position of saying something nice about mining companies. But the truth is that
very careful.
for many years, the policies of BHP and Rio Tinto and the like have been streets ahead of their industry associations. Not INIS's, I hasten to add. And in fact, in line with AIG, as I understand it. So I just don't understand how this could happen. And there is tension driven by investor groups, institutional investors, and I suppose that's a good thing. The furor that some of BHP's announcements have caused about companies keeping out of social issues is just astounding, really. We need corporate Australia to play a role in the social and political dimension more fully, I think. And we won't get bipartisanship on key policies like energy and climate and many others unless business does stand up. The reason to stay optimistic is that it is bipartisan in so much of the world. It's just been horribly partisan here, and it's a great big social experiment that we could all do without.
So I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to ask others to sort of respond to that question, starting with you, Martijn, but if we can keep the comments, so I wouldn't mind a few questions from the floor as well.
Sure. So I think on the whole, I'd say that business is not streams ahead of policy. I think what's interesting is the major driver that I see of changing business behaviour is actually the people in the room here. It's actually investors and shareholders that are coming to businesses and saying you need to change. And so everyone here is pretty much across TCFD. Most businesses we talk to are not. BHP, who I'd actually do a lot of work for, have done some incredible stuff. But at the same time, you had we had a very senior member of BP here last week telling us how important the continuing of oil and gas was. I mean, around the edges, investing $300 million when you're a $1 trillion company in a little bit of renewables does not really move the dial. And I think that at the end of the day, we've talked about uncertainty and business needs certainty. There is always a group of outliers like Tesla and others that are really trying to move things ahead. When governments set a very clear policy to transition a sector of the economy like electric vehicle target and phasing out, then industry moves fast. But on the whole, I think globally, business is much more aware of the issues, but they're still not. Most of the business that I deal with are still not aware how to deal with the issues, and that's the challenge that we face.
Sarah?
Look, I'm still not sure quite what to make. I feel like we're in a slightly new world order at the moment, a little bit, and it seems to me that the business community is they're pretty objective, they analyse things closely, they talk to their stakeholders, but governments seem to be talking to almost a different set of stakeholders, and getting a different response because they're behaving differently to the business community at the moment, and there does seem to be a gap, particularly around energy and climate policy, between what government is intending to do and how it sees itself responding to the needs of its constituents, and how business is responding to the needs of its own constituents. And I think that's going to be a really interesting dynamic to play out, certainly through the rest of this electoral term.
Ines?
I'll just make a couple of points, I think. Not all business is the same. So there are different businesses in different sectors at different stages of their cycles, different stages of development with different focuses. So I think we need to keep that in mind. But by and large, I would argue that I wouldn't say perhaps that they're ahead of government, but they're on a different track to government would be how I'd put it. You talk to CEOs of major companies, significant companies in Australia, and by and large, they see where the trend lines are. They see what's happening internationally. They see what investors are saying. They hear that very loud and clear. They hear what shareholders are saying. And they are responding to that as best as they can. But fundamentally, the first role of business is to stay in business. So businesses are making decisions around new investments, around R&D and the like, on the basis that they do have to plan for the future. They do have a horizon which is, strangely enough, more than 3 years ahead. They have two horizons, really. They have the next quarter, but they then have a long-term horizon to position their business, over the next decade or so. So businesses are making decisions. They are making investments. They are making bets and taking calls and making calls here at all sorts of levels, businesses large and small, because they have to. They're investing in energy efficiency because they have to keep their costs down. They're investing in renewables because it's the most efficient way of providing energy for their organisation at the moment, or to put into the grid. They are looking forward in transport to electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles. They're aware of the trends. They're not just sitting there thinking, God, how am I going to screw another dollar out of today? And they're hearing loud and clear from shareholders. So I saw something from Ian Silk, who runs Australian Super, the other day. We do member forums, and there's a whole panoply of people there saying, can you do more, invest more in green, if I can call it that? But we don't have a big take-up of that among members in that particular space. But I take from that two things. There is the desire to do it, and there is perhaps underneath that an expectation that we are doing that anyhow. And we need to be alert to that. And the second thing is, members, when you're playing with their pensions, they want a return. So you've got to find the best way to get a return, and there's short and long-term ways of doing that too. But there is certainly growing pressure coming on investors from members of, say, of superannuation companies to do much more in this space, and that is only going to grow.
Thank you. I'll throw it open to the floor. If there's any questions, I'm sort of looking for hands. Yes? You've got the microphone.
Hi, my name's Jodie Barnes. I'm from the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors. I'm just interested in hearing what you say to those who criticise potentially your industry groups or others in the near periphery that have added to the policy inertia and chaos that we've had. We've often seen companies act a step ahead of both government and their industry associations. So I'm interested in hearing if you've made explicit commitments to Paris and whether that includes the Kyoto carryover credits.
I'll let you have a go, Ines.
I think that was aimed at me. Again, industry associations are... mine represents thousands of businesses, so across a range of sectors. Not all businesses have the same view or the same viewpoint. Some get ahead of others. Yes, we have been, thank you, Tony, for your support. We have been out front and upfront around Paris commitment, 2 degrees, recognising that zero emissions, completely supportive around that. You don't find us being at all critical. That's the world that we're living in and the reality that we deal with. So I would just say that, you know, not all members of organisations have the same views. For us, I can tell you, I aged decades in the past decade trying to, it's like been like dog years in many ways, trying to balance off competing interests, competing perspectives, competing viewpoints, all wholly legitimate at various times as the debate has gone forward. So we have operated around a series of principles. We've tried to bring together different organisations into conversations so that there is a broader community of interest. That's what we do. We get criticised and I'll call them activist groups, criticise us and others for not being strong enough on this or hard enough on that, or for making a comment here and picking up a word there, or talking about a particular issue. But as I said before, we have been very upfront. Part of what we try to do in any industry association, as you would in the superannuation industry, is try to reflect the two things. Try to reflect the broad view and as much of a consensus as you can get, and also try to lead or steer or inform conversations. That's largely what we try to do.
Thank you. Nick Heath from the conservation sector. Firstly, congratulations to the panel. What an extraordinary panel. The solution exists between you. I think it's an extraordinary panel. Secondly, could we take that solution between you to the next level? Can there be like a public unlikely alliance, even if you just share the lowest common denominator of all your positions more forcefully, collaboratively, to lower the error bars for politicians? They're not leading because the risks are too great. You can lower the risks by working collectively. And lastly, if you feel that's not enough, maybe the unlikely alliance needs Rupert Murdoch as well. Combine yourselves with Rupert and you will be unbreakable.
There is an organisation called the Australian Climate Roundtable, which I suggest you have a look at, which is an amalgam of business groups, welfare groups, investor groups, unions, farmers, heavy industry representatives who meet regularly and discuss these issues and find the commonalities. And we've been working together now for about 3 years. My organisation sort of steers it in a way, but where we're trying to find are those commonalities, and there are more than you think among all of those. The ultimate commonality is that we all want this solved and we all want certainty. So we do get together. We are in rooms regularly discussing these things, and we are also putting forward papers and positions which reflect consensus where we can find it. We're not Pollyannas. We're not all going to agree on everything all of the time, but it's the 80-20 rule, I think, is in play there. If you can get most of what you want for your constituency, you'll take that.
Well, you guys are also members of the Roundtable. Did you guys want to add anything to that?
No, it's a very useful forum, and the problem we've got is that the government's not particularly receptive to anybody's point of view, and that's the political and social dimension we've got to deal with, either as separate organisations or jointly. It is hard to change that, and the problem we've got is that they got a dirty great big dividend for the position they took to the last election. So that's the reality we have to struggle with. I mean, we have to take into account the political dimension of the challenge.
I think we've got time for one more question.
Pablo Barudi from Stewart Investors. I have a question about hope and inspiration, which, and Martijn touched on it a little bit, but in May I was at the Climate Reality Leaders Forum and almost fell off my chair when Mike Cannon-Brookes talked about having a 200% renewable energy target, because I'd never heard that before, and I was stunned, and the logic being it's easier to get to 200 than it is to get to 90 or 100 because that last 10% is hard. And then just last week, with Finkel and talking about 700% renewable energy target and the potential to export hydrogen, and of course the head of Martein's organisation, ARENA, supporting that. And so I was really keen to hear the perspectives of people on the panel, because to me that's probably one of the greatest sources of hope and inspiration I've heard in the years that I've been involved in this issue, on what are the challenges, what's the viability of that, can we really get behind a really big moonshot vision like 700% renewable energy target.
Yes, I think you will hear a lot more about this in the coming months. And I don't want to steal some of the thunder. I think our CEO, Darren, is going to do a speech where he's going to talk a bit about this, but it builds upon what Finkel and others have been saying. And I think the reality is that the view is that the more renewables you have in the system, if you get to 200%, then it's obviously a lot cheaper. It creates, you'll basically fix the demand problem within the energy sector. Huge amount of opportunity then for export, for manufacturing, for other things to build out that. I don't think it's a moonshot. We did it with LNG, and Finkel will tell you that with LNG, it was a 30-year process. We started where we are now and all the way through. We've got Mike and others backing the project up in the Northern Territory at the moment to export to Singapore. There are different views on that, but it's another big sort of vision. So I think this is exactly what we need to do. And I just come back to Mike made the comment in the last meeting, and anyone in this room should not underestimate the impact of not only Greta Thunberg but also of Extinction Rebellion. So when I was in the UK a few months ago, there were two things that dominated were Extinction Rebellion and Brexit. That's all that anyone was talking about. It was quite interesting. The ripple effect of Extinction Rebellion and what's going on there, I think, is driving quite a lot of change. And I think that basically these big picture ideas will get up. They will start to get up. I mean, a lot of people said that there's no way that Norway will transition to their electric vehicle targets by 2027. But, they're well on the way, right? So as long as you have a clear policy agenda and vision there, which is one of the challenges. But if they don't do it, the private sector will do it. One of the interesting things that Jay Weatherall said after his exit from politics was the one thing that made it so easy for them to do the battery in South Australia was the cover he got from Cannon Brooks and from Tesla. That cover enabled the government to move. So if you've got some brave people that are prepared to run this vision, then I think there's a huge opportunity for Australia. We've got to think, we should be asking, what do we want our economy to look like in 10, 20 years' time? And what are the big investments we can make now to transition our economy towards net zero emissions, but also towards boosting more jobs, more industry, more manufacturing? There's huge opportunities for us in this space, and we really need to be taking advantage of them.
Did you want to make a very clear? So I think that's it for the panel. We're out of time. I think for me the sort of takeaways were a couple of things. One is that obviously we're in a very challenging policy environment in Australia, but I think it's pretty clear that there are some opportunities which all of us can be working towards collectively and individually. And that doesn't just mean that doesn't mean just private conversations. I think Tony's point, for example, around engaging with the politics and the social dimensions of this issue is really, really important and a challenge to us all. So join me in thanking the panel for a great session.